Welcome to the wonderful village of Giggleswick, located among the spectacular southern foothills of the wild Yorkshire Dales. Surrounded by lush scenery whichever way you look, Giggleswick is a picture postcard village, home to a small and serene local community, as well as one of the oldest and most prestigious schools in the region. Here, we find ourselves on the edge of the village looking over the grounds of Giggleswick School, which was established over 500 years ago in 1499, and which is the dominant feature in this village of few more than 1,000 people. Today, the school campus effectively takes up half the village, with expansive grounds and a number of historic and imposing buildings, the grandest of which we can see just up ahead. This is the School Chapel, built over 4 years and opened in 1901. Instantly recognisable by its signature dome, the chapel was deliberately designed to fit in with the hilly landscape that surrounds Giggleswick, and is just as impressive on the inside too, as the place where boarding and day students can participate in church services. Now from this point by the school's playing fields, we'll make our way down the hill towards the centre of Giggleswick. But you might be wondering why such a large and old school was founded in this small countryside village in the first place. Well, to get a better understanding of that, we first need to break out the map, and see exactly where you'd find Giggleswick in the country. As you can see here, Giggleswick is located on the southwestern edge of the Yorkshire Dales National Park, and just to the northwest of the market town of Skipton, the so-called gateway to the Yorkshire Dales. Now the Yorkshire Dales are peppered with wonderful and historic villages, just like Giggleswick here, surrounded by mighty hills and peaks that make up one of the most undulating parts of the English countryside, providing a wonderful backdrop that only adds to the village's character. As we continue down the slope here, ahead in the distance we can see an example of those eye-catching hills, these being part of the Warrendale Knots, standing 440 metres or 1,444 feet high over Giggleswick and the larger neighbouring town of Settle. On this walk we'll make our way through this village towards the River Ribble, where Giggleswick meets Settle. But the distinctive hills that surround this region aren't where the history of Giggleswick School began. In fact, the school was founded back in 1499 by the village's local priest, a man named James Carr, who became the school's first headmaster. At first the school was run by local priests, and based around the parish church of St Alkelda, which we'll visit later on in our walk. But over time, the small local educational establishment grew in size and stature. After being saved from closure in the early 16th century, Giggleswick School was awarded a royal charter in 1553 by King Edward VI, which makes it one of the oldest public schools in the UK. That's public school in the British sense, similar to the likes of Harrow, Winchester, and the prestigious Eton College, which was founded just 59 years before Giggleswick here. For a school located in such a small village in one of the most sparsely populated areas of Yorkshire, the scale of the campus here is rather impressive, although as active school grounds, we can't simply waltz in and explore its beautiful buildings. If you are visiting Giggleswick, do remember that the school grounds here are private property, although the school is proud of its history, and so if you are interested in exploring the institution in closer detail, you can ask at reception, who offer the chance to look inside the splendid chapel we saw just a couple of minutes ago. Otherwise, of course, Giggleswick is a fully operational day and boarding school, with as many as 500 pupils at any one time studying away. But with such a long history, over the years, the prestigious school here has even played host to a number of famous names, in recent decades including Richard Whiteley, the former presenter of TV's Countdown, who studied here in the 1950s, as did actor Anthony Daniels, who played C-3PO in the Star Wars movies. Those are just a couple of the famous faces who have made their way through this very high-achieving school, which continues to excel in all areas from academics to sport, while the school even has its own official Royal Marine Cadets, just another part that makes up a remarkable school in this very small village. If you're in the area, then the school here certainly stands as a cradle of history in the village, but of course there's more to Giggleswick than the famous school which bears its name. So as we now make our way past the small school shop, let's turn our attention to the village as a whole. While Giggleswick School at this end of the village is typically busy with activity during school hours, the rest of this village is generally very serene, home to around 1,000 people who live on just a few streets. Notably, however, the streets of Giggleswick are almost entirely residential, and there are almost no shops in the entire village. Fortunately, Giggleswick's proximity to Settle means that locals don't have to drive too far to get their groceries. In fact, a short stroll over the River Ribble will lead you right towards the shops and markets of Settle. Now the River Ribble, which as we mentioned we'll see at the end of our walk, flows for a mighty 75 miles all the way towards the city of Preston and the Irish Sea. However, in the heart of Giggleswick here, we're walking past an altogether much smaller waterway, a tiny stream known by the name Tems Beck. Not to be confused with the river that flows through London, Tems Beck, spelt T-E-M-S, is one of many streams that trickle down from the hills of the Yorkshire Dales into the River Ribble. However, more than simply existing as a tributary, it appears that much of the village of Giggleswick has grown up around the Thames, with a network of old bridges crossing the stream here. Though it's by no means a major waterway, Tems Beck does provide a serene soundtrack to the centre of Giggleswick with its trickling flow, making it a lovely stream to walk alongside, while many also enjoy fishing a little further downstream, as the Thames is known for its healthy population of brown trout fish, who swim from the Ribble towards their spawning grounds further upstream. The peace and quiet beside the calmly flowing Tems Beck is just one example of what makes Giggleswick such a serene village. So serene, in fact, that many people tend to holiday here to get away from the hustle and bustle of England's busier and noisier towns and cities. There are a wide variety of holiday cottages all over Giggleswick today, with a number of pleasant countryside walking trails emanating from the village and providing holidaymakers with a perfect outlet. Although this village is fortunate not to become overwhelmed by tourists at any time of the year, retaining its peaceful atmosphere that makes it a lovely place to stroll around and explore. Of course, while you can venture out into the countryside and climb some of the many hills that make up the Yorkshire Dales, Giggleswick Village is home to a great deal of intriguing local history, not least that of the story behind the village's interesting name. Though it certainly gives a chuckle to many who pass by here, the origin of Giggleswick's name are rather simple, being Viking in origin, and referring to a farm, or wick, that belonged to a man known by the name Giggle. The Vikings, who dominated this region of England between the 9th and 11th centuries AD, are also theorised by some to have been the origin for the equally distinctive name of the village's parish church here. This is St Alkelda's church, which was built in the 14th century, and which notably is one of only 2 parish churches in Britain dedicated to the Saint Alkelda. Now, while the church before us here is around 700 years old, it's thought that a church of some form has stood on this site for well over 1,000 years, ever since the Saxon era, when Alkelda herself was alive. We'll talk more about who exactly Alkelda was in a few minutes, but let's not forget that the church here was also genesis for Giggleswick's famous school. As we mentioned, it was the priest of St Alkelda's, James Carr, who was also the man who founded Giggleswick School in 1499, and although after the granting of the Royal Charter in 1553 the teaching buildings moved towards their current site, the parish church continued to function as the old school chapel, to which hundreds of students would walk from up the hill. However, over time, the large numbers of students began to cause problems, overwhelming the small population of locals who also attended the church. Although the school contributed to the upkeep of the parish church in the village, it eventually became clear that a separate chapel was needed for the growing numbers of students, leading to the building of the Grand School Chapel from 1897, where pupil services are held to this day. But having made our way out of the parish churchyard, we now find ourselves beside Giggleswick's historic main road, once home to the local marketplace, and besides which there also stands the Black Horse, the oldest pub in Giggleswick's village centre. Located in this building from 1663, the pub, which was sold in 2019, has been reopened under new ownership since this walk was filmed, meaning that the cosy accommodation and characterful bar that has existed in this village for centuries will remain for years to come. Standing right beside St Alkelda's church, the Black Horse pub has been at the heart of life in Giggleswick for a long time, also standing just a few steps away from the village market, whose historic location is denoted by this medieval-era market cross. Thought to date from the 14th century, the market cross has stood right here for centuries, and is older than many of the houses surrounding us. Church Street as a whole is the oldest thoroughfare in Giggleswick, and the view from this point, with the market cross in the foreground and the parish church behind, has remained almost identical for the best part of 700 years. That is, except for the Ford Fiesta and the traffic cones, of course. Lining the length of Church Street, meanwhile, is an array of houses that, while being younger than the church and market cross, are no spring chickens themselves. Most of the houses on Church Street were built in the 17th century, and have since remained largely unchanged, the street therefore giving us an especially genuine window into the past, and how Giggleswick looked hundreds of years ago. And what's especially great about the houses on Church Street is that they have date markers, telling us exactly when they were built. This one above the doorway telling us that the house dates from 1689, over 330 years ago. The old houses of Church Street are eye-catching enough themselves, but Church Street as a whole offers an especially picturesque view down the slope towards St Alkelda's church. But speaking of St Alkelda's, who exactly was Alkelda? And why are there only 2 churches in the whole country dedicated to her? Well, it's most commonly thought that Alkelda was an Anglo-Saxon princess, or perhaps a nun or abbess, who lived in the 8th century. She may have been a person of major note both in Giggleswick and the town of Middleham, just 30 miles away, but it appears that the Anglo-Saxon Alkelda encountered trouble with the marauding Vikings in this region. According to legend, Alkelda died around the year 800 AD when she was strangled by Viking women after she had set out on a journey from Giggleswick here. She was then possibly buried on the site of the Church of St Mary and St Alkelda in the town of Middleham, which stands today as the only other church dedicated to Alkelda. That being said, however, the entire story of the Anglo-Saxon Princess Alkelda is steeped in legend, and having accordingly happened over 1,000 years ago, the line between reality and mythology is less than clear. It's even possible that Alkelda never even existed. The idea that the Princess Alkelda never existed then begs the question of why the church here was ever dedicated to her. According to a separate theory, the name Alkelda may have been inspired by the natural scenery surrounding Giggleswick, more specifically, natural springs that you'll find just outside the village. The springs, which give rise to the clear mountain waters of the Yorkshire Dales, were recognised by settlers from Iceland who came to this area around 1,000 years ago. And perhaps coincidentally, in northwestern Iceland there are 2 natural springs which bear the name Alkelda, which may have been the inspiration for Icelandic settlers to name the springs outside Giggleswick. Alkelda then became Alkelda, but it's entirely possible that we'll never find the real truth behind the saint of Giggleswick's wonderful parish church. Now, we've made our way up the hill from the parish church onto Bankwell Road here, having effectively passed through the very small centre of Giggleswick. And from this point, we're now going to make our way down towards the edge of the village, marked by the River Ribble, which you'll find just a stone's throw from here, behind the lovely Queen's Rock House in front of us, another splendid cottage that was built in the 18th century and is still full of colour today. The many houses and cottages lived in either by locals or holidaymakers make up the wonderfully quiet and primarily residential village of Giggleswick. But behind Queen's Rock House, there's a conveniently placed route between the houses that will take us towards the riverside, and which is regularly used by residents to walk into the bigger town of Settle just across the river. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the River Ribble is a major waterway of northern England, flowing for 75 miles towards the city of Preston in Lancashire, and then the Irish Sea, and it's one of just a few rivers whose sources are located in the Yorkshire Dales that flow in a westerly direction. In Preston, and at its mouth to the south of Blackpool, the Ribble is a huge tidal waterway, but here in Giggleswick, it's a much smaller river that serves as the focus of Ribblesdale, the valley through which the Ribble flows here in the Yorkshire Dales. And as we come down the slope, We now find ourselves by the riverside, which is a much calmer place today than it was historically. This section of the Ribble having once upon a time been packed with mills powered by the river's flow, and which made a wide variety of products, from everything including textiles and cotton, to one rather notable local mill that was known as Old Snuff, so named as it produced sniffing tobacco. Apparently, sniffing tobacco was produced here because Ribblesdale was closely linked in trade to the town of Kendal in the old county of Westmoreland, which was known as the smoking capital of the north. Now, however, we're making our way onto the Giggleswick Memorial Bridge, which crosses the raging River Ribble at this point above the Queen's Rock, which you can see below on the left of the picture. For the most part, the Ribble flows very calmly through this area of the Yorkshire Dales, but the Queen's Rock and others break up that serene flow dramatically, turning the river into a bit of a raging torrent as it passes underneath this footbridge, providing a spectacular but fairly loud soundtrack for those walking to the shops in Settle. Of course, it all calms down again very quickly as the river continues downstream towards the Ribble estuary and the Irish Sea, a fair distance away from the wonderful little village of Giggleswick here. Sadly, however, that brings an end to our walk around Giggleswick for today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're looking forward to visiting Giggleswick for yourself sometime soon.